Take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Who gon' take it there? Electricity, 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 electricity. You know what's in the air. 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 It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility. It's possibility.
All right, so people have been passing around this video of Peter Thiel. He did an interview, another one of these long-form New York Times podcasts. This guy, Ross Douthatt, he sat down with Peter Thiel, who is the founder of Palantir, former investor, I believe, in PayPal and other tech companies, very prominent tech CEO, very influential in politics, has given to various politicians and also created different infrastructures. He's essentially acting as a contractor and creating tools for the Trump administration to consolidate data on all Americans, as well as immigrants, undocumented immigrants, documented immigrants, and essentially make it easier for them to track and surveil citizens. So that is kind of what puts Peter Thiel at the forefront of the political conversation. But he has weird ideas about authoritarianism, and he basically in this interview lays out the view that progress has stagnated in human history, despite the fact that, you know, we're on the general upward incline in terms of technology, etc. The actual rate of acceleration is slowing from the rate of acceleration in the past, and that's a problem, and it's existential. And with Peter Thiel, it leads to all these weird ideas about authoritarianism, that essentially the processes of democracy and of basing governmental rule on the sort of the will of the masses is too slow of a process, and so there needs to be something faster moving. But when you apply that logic to government, you essentially end up with something amounting to authoritarianism. And so in many ways, Peter Thiel has advocated for authoritarianism. Now, they touch on that a little bit in this conversation, but that's my main critique here, is that this guy does not press Peter Thiel very hard at all about, you know, what he actually believes in, what it is that he's doing with this technology. And in fact, this guy, Ross Douthatt, I think is how you say it, he is mainly, you know, does commentary on religion and, like, you know, from a Christian perspective. And so that's kind of how he's talking to Peter Thiel here. And I guess in some ways, that's probably why this conversation happened, why he was the right person to talk to Peter Thiel. But at the same time, he is not very critical and doesn't really dive into the meat of why Peter Thiel is such a controversial and kind of terrifying figure. Except at the end, very end of the interview, where he kind of builds up to this thing of asking Peter Thiel, do you think that you could be contributing to the rise of the Antichrist? Which is an interesting and funny question, but that seems to be the kind of the thesis of this whole interview. This was the main thing that he wants to get to. So I'll play that clip and a couple other clips from the interview so you get a sense of what Peter Thiel was talking about here, and then we'll talk more about some other things.
Or do you think it's just hype? Do you think people are trying to raise money by pretending that we're going to build a machine god, right? Is it hype? Is it delusion? Is it something you worry about? I think you would prefer the human race to endure, right? You're hesitating.
Yeah, well,
yes?
I don't know. I would
This is a long hesitation. This is a long hesitation.
There's so many questions implicit in this.
Should the human race survive?
Yes.
Okay.
But I also would I also would like us to radically solve these problems.
Right.
But I always think that if we're going to have this frame of talking about existential risks, perhaps we should also talk about the risk of another type of a bad singularity, which I would describe as the one world totalitarian state. Because I would say the political solution, the default political solution people have for all these existential risks is one world governance. what do you do about nuclear weapons? We have a United Nations with real teeth that controls them, and they're controlled by an international political order. And then something like this, is also what do we do about AI? And we need global compute governance. We need a one world government to control all the computers, log every single keystroke to make sure people don't program a dangerous AI. And I've been wondering whether that's sort of a going from the frying pan into the fire. And so the atheist philosophical framing is one world or none.
Invested in palantir, in military technology, in technologies of surveillance, in technologies of warfare, and so on, right? And it just seems to me that when you tell me a story about the Antichrist coming to power and using the fear of technological change to sort of impose order on the world, I feel like that Antichrist would maybe be using the tools that you were building, right? Like, wouldn't the Antichrist be like, great, we're not going to have any more technological progress, but I really like what Palantir has done so far, right?
Yeah,
isn't that a concern? Wouldn't that be the irony of history would be that the man publicly worrying about the Antichrist accidentally hastens his or her arrival?
There are all these different scenarios. I obviously don't think that that's what I'm doing.
To be clear, I don't think that's what you're doing either. I'm just interested in how you get to a world willing to submit to permanent authoritarian rule.
Well, but again, there are these different gradations of this we can describe. But is this so preposterous, what I've just told you, as a broad account of the stagnation that the entire world has submitted for 50 years to peace and safetyism? This is 1 Thessalonians 5:3. The slogan of the Antichrist is peace and safety, and we've submitted to, the FDA regulates not just drugs in the U.S., but de facto in the whole world, because the rest of the world defers to the FDA. The Nuclear Regulatory Commission effectively regulates nuclear power plants all over the world. People, you can't design a modular nuclear reactor and just build it in Argentina. They won't trust the Argentinian regulators. They're going to defer to the U.S. And so it's at least a question about why we've had 50 years of stagnation. And one answer is we ran out of ideas. The other answer is something happened culturally where it wasn't allowed. And then the cultural answer can be sort of a bottom-up answer, that it was just some transformation of humanity into this sort of more docile kind of a species. Or it can be at least partially top-down, that there's this, this machinery of government that got changed into this stagnations thing. I think something like this, nuclear power was supposed to be the power of the. So yeah, that last century.
Question is the moment that everybody is kind of passing around as, the moment that Peter Thiel is kind of balking at the idea that he is the Antichrist, even though he goes around talking about the Antichrist and blah, blah, blah. And obviously, those on the left, people who are actually skeptical of, consolidation of government power in this way, are pointing out and are familiar with the idea that Peter Thiel is kind of this villain, right? He just has a, Batman villain type of aura, and his mannerisms are consistent with that throughout this interview. I watched the whole thing, and like I said, I kind of combed through it, and there really just wasn't a lot of like what the implications of Peter Thiel's belief systems are and what it means to have the type of power that he has. I mean, they sort of touch on those things, but this guy's clearly mostly interested, this interviewer, in this idea of like how Peter Thiel is contributing to the biblical, I guess, prophecy, or maybe just like biblical proliferation, which is something that Peter Thiel talks about, you know what I mean? And he talks about these things with a religious framework, which is where they're getting this Antichrist thing. But at the same time, you know, I can pretty easily answer this guy's question about why Peter Thiel doesn't consider the fact that he might be contributing to the rise of the, you know, false idol machine god, which is that he doesn't care about that. And he doesn't believe in any of that shit, actually. And I think a lot of these guys, they view themselves as on the forefront of human thought and human innovation and obviously capitalism and influence. And so to them, religion is more of like a plaything than anything else. Like in the same way that your average person would kind of pick and choose the parts of a religion that they identify with the most and kind of wrap their beliefs around that, and everybody's interpretation of their religious beliefs is kind of different. I think when it comes to guys who have the type of power that these dudes have, where they're almost bored, they're bored with life, they're bored with humanity, and they view themselves as basically being fit to reshape these ideas in a way that is, you know, more productive for humanity. Now, in the case of Peter Thiel, he clearly is one of these guys who doesn't really care what happens to the rest of humanity, to humanity at large. And I think in this pursuit of what he wants is faster acceleration of societal progress, really meaning like technological innovation. When he's talking about societal momentum, what he's only ever talking about is this sort of like breathless pace of technology and capitalist enclosure that turns a profit from resources and creates, you know, vast structures of technological consumerism that lots and lots of people participate in, and therefore generates lots and lots of revenue. And so that's the kind of acceleration that Peter Thiel seems to want. And it seems to me that there's an end goal in it for him more so than it is about the benefit of the rest of humanity. He is more interested in whatever his equivalent of going to Mars would be, right? Like, as of right now, there's not the adequate conditions for Peter Thiel. How is he going to create the conditions for his own survival? He talks a little bit about transhumanism here, you know, the immortal, you know, digital self or whatever. And he clearly feels that we are not close enough to that point, and we're not moving fast enough to get to that point. And so that is why he is trying to slash at the pillars of society that are getting in the way of that particular progress. And so another thing that he talks about kind of having fear of here is the sort of one world government, that this idea that like all information in the world or all decisions in the world are made from a top-down source and enforced globally, etc. He even uses the UN as an example in terms of like regulating nuclear weapons. And so that is the fully extrapolated version of what Peter Thiel has fear of, is a government that is the ultimate authority. Because these billionaires are powerful enough that they know that a government has a lot of authority in terms of how you operate within a certain country, but there's also ways to get around that. And so the billionaires are the ones who are global, and they have their assets tied up in different places, and they know how to move money around to get around certain regulations, etc. And so the ultimate fear for a person who's set up their life that way is the consolidation of a government that can actually exercise authority over them. And so maybe it's less about a one world government, but more so about a government that can actually do its job and enforce its laws. And that does require international cooperation and some sort of structure of authority that applies globally. So I don't know, just some thoughts. I think definitely watching this full interview, Peter Thiel is clearly a psychopath. This other guy who interviewed him doesn't really seem up for the job. Like I said, he seems more interested about asking him about the Antichrist than like any serious questions about, what his current role in politics is. But there's plenty to get into there. There's a story floating around now that Stephen Miller has a large stake in Palantir, which has contracts with ICE and is building these facilities, detention facilities for migrants, and the facilities to, track, surveil, and arrest them, as well as Palantir having already been contracted by ICE to do like very detailed tracking of immigrants, and that's probably how they're finding them at work and scooping them up off the street and doing these very targeted raid operations. So Stephen Miller is by far the most psychopathic, front-facing member of the Trump administration, second only maybe to Trump himself. But many of the things Stephen Miller has said are much worse than things Trump has said. Everyone will submit to the authority of the federal government and that sort of thing. He's a full-on psycho and, fully on board with completely utilizing the power of the federal government to do whatever they want. Abuses of power, abuses of civil rights be damned. The Supreme Court has also just cleared the way for the Trump administration to do exactly that. Basically, they decided in the birthright citizenship case that lower courts don't have the ability to make certain injunctions to stop the administration. And so while there still could be challenges that, float up to the higher courts that ultimately, supposedly, would stop the administration, a lot of the court's lower ability to stop them in the meantime, which is what has placed a hamper on certain immigration policies or their anti-transgender policies. In many cases, not in all cases, but in many cases, the courts will have less power to do that. So that's going to allow the Trump administration to move a lot quicker on some of their pet projects. And like I've been saying, get things done that they want to get done, disappear people, and, destroy certain government infrastructures in the meantime while the courts are still working it out whether or not he's allowed to do that. And so obviously, clearly, people like Stephen Miller, people like Peter Thiel, and many others like them are creating the architecture of an all-powerful, plutocratic, technocratic government. And so all this talk about authoritarianism and fear of top-down authority that you hear from Peter Thiel and supposed libertarians like this, it's all bullshit, because what they want is concentration of their power. And the second they get the opportunity to concentrate their power, they seize on it. And that's what separates a Stephen Miller, for example, from the rest of the Trump administration officials since the first one that have been on a revolving door. Stephen Miller's been there since the beginning. And the reason is because Stephen Miller is willing to seize, capitalize on, and utilize power. And that is why Trump likes him. So I think that it is a good idea to use this corruption charge, not that he's been charged with anything, but there's now information clearly out there that implicates Stephen Miller in corruption related to this immigration stuff. And obviously nothing matters when it comes to the Trump administration. But in the case of Elon Musk, painting him as the face of corruption and the face of a billionaire who's going in there and taking away things from the government that you need, it worked. It made him politically toxic, and ultimately the Trump administration castigated him, pushed him off into the darkness. Elon almost went on this crusade against Trump and then chickened out. And so I think it's about time that we get Stephen Miller out of there, is what I'm saying. And we need to make Stephen Miller the face of this, because not many people know him, not many people know Peter Thiel, and that's part of the problem with these guys. But Stephen Miller is front-facing. People do know him, and more people are going to hate him as time goes on. So we need to make him the face of this including this corruption and all of the atrocities that happen because of ICE, which in many cases he's directly responsible for. And we really need to remind people about that constantly, because as of right now, if there's anybody in the Trump administration aside from Trump himself that really needs to go, it's Stephen Miller. And as for Palantir, there have been some protests lately that shut down a couple Palantir buildings, some arrests made. A group called Planet Over Profit has essentially been targeting different office buildings of Palantir's and staging demonstrations, organizing protests. In Palo Alto in California, which was, a protest that was hosted at the same time as I think 6 people were arrested in New York, like 200 people showed up to the Palo Alto office and shut down the operations. So some pressure is starting to be applied to Palantir because people are identifying that Peter Thiel and Palantir are one of the major sources of the administration's power, and they are rapidly and deliberately moving to make the administration as powerful as possible. So that is an important place to pose resistance, and definitely need to highlight some of these psychopathic things that Stephen Miller or Peter Thiel might be saying, because a lot of people aren't aware about it. But I mean, these are the people that the comic books warned you about.